Hello, and welcome to a Malts and Meeples preview or review little video talking about Perdition's Mouth Abyssal Rift. The designers were kind enough to send me a copy to look at. So, let's talk about this game from Timo Mutlecki, Thomas Klossner, and Kevin Wilson. Perdition's Mouth is going to be a horror-themed dungeon crawl game, and in particular, Perdition's Mouth Abyssal Rift here. And it's going to be a dungeon crawler that uses less randomness than almost any other dungeon crawler that I've played. And this is done through a few different ways. But in particular, there are no dice in this game. There is no dice chucking, so you only have so much variability, which we'll talk about here coming up in a second. But before I get to that, I do want to talk about this theme. This, like I said, is a horror kind of survival game as you go through these different maps, fighting monsters, cultists, and you are trying to survive, get through the area, get to the next spot, so that you can fight the end. Your big bad monsters. This isn't maybe quite as scary as this guy, but very big monsters down there. Plus then a whole bunch of smaller monsters on the way. Now, with that, this game has a dark theme. So, I will say it's not a negative, not a positive, but be aware of that going into this. This is going to be a game that is darker. It's going to be intended for a more mature audience. And, well, mechanically, I think it works exceedingly well. I do think for some people the theme might be off-putting. I don't mind it, and I think it comes through well in what you're doing. But there definitely are going to be some people who this maybe isn't the right theme for. Let's talk a little bit about the mechanics, and I have a few things to show off with that. And we're going to start with the fact that this game is mainly a Rondel kind of action point style game. This is the player Rondel. This is the monster Rondel. And the monsters will go around doing various actions here, spawning, moving, and attacking. And you can pretty easily get overrun. But as the characters, you have some more different actions you can take. But everything you do costs you action points. So, say I was here, and I wanted to go all the way to attack over here, I would need to spend 3 action points. 1, 2, all the way over here for 3 to be able to do that. And I only have a limited number of action points. And you're also using those action points, like on the charge, to move as well. So everything you're doing is eating up those action points as you work your way around this rondel. Now, some of them, over here, we have our special, that only has 1 spot. So if that is filled in, you can skip that whole section when counting to spend your action points. But it makes it a really interesting puzzle. And it also is an interesting puzzle, too, with how it locks down movement. So I do get a little bit of a feel, though very different thematically, there's a little bit of a feel of something like Gloomhaven. But Gloomhaven is freer in how you can move. Still have to move orthogonally, so up, down, left, right, not diagonally. But this one, there's more things that block and fewer ways to get around that. And with that, you also then have cards. And these cards are specific to each character, which is one thing that I really like that they did. And in my playthroughs, I've done a tank and kind of more of a caster type character, and working those two together has been really interesting. But they also have unique cards to them. The tank had more options to aid, at least that what I've gotten through. Because in this game you have your handful of cards and they might improve your attack, for example. But you don't draw up at the end of the turn. You play cards on your turn to improve your effects, to maybe be able to move further or whatever it might be. And with that, you're losing cards from your hand. Now there are ways, certain spots that allow you to draw cards, or resting allows you to draw back up to your hand size, but that's limiting what you can do. Add in the fact that then you have the enemies you have to contend with as well. Obviously, if this is a dungeon crawler, you're going to have enemies that you have to deal with as well. And enemies, like I said, they have their own Rondel, and they have things that move around the board. But unlike the players who select a specific action on the board, all the monsters do. So let's say we started here on move. Monsters would move. Then monsters would attack. Then we'd spawn. And if they moved, say 5, they move again and attack again. So there can be a lot that happens with the monsters going on, but it's all controlled by this. And each monster has pretty simple stats. You have their movement, you have their defense, their attack, and their range. So stuff that is very easy to keep track of. Where it gets to be a little bit challenging, because my tank character, for some of the weaker ones, not for some of the bigger guys, would be able to take an attack, most likely. Now, I have here some of the modifier cards, and the enemy uses these to modify their attacks. Now, there's a lot of different ones. Some of them might be helpful. Some of them, well, less so. The trick, though, is that only the enemy really gets to modify their attack. There's a couple spots on the player board. So, defending, for example, or sprinting. Both of those get to draw one of these cards. But every time an enemy attacks, they draw one of these cards. Every time an enemy defends, they draw one of these cards. So that's why you're having to figure out that hand management piece. So let's talk a little bit about maybe what doesn't work as well. So let's start out with this rule book. This rule book is 43, 44 pages long. There are a lot of examples in here, a lot of pictures of various things. And they even have kind of a starting set of scenarios that can work to go through for this campaign. But the rule book, and this is the revised edition, so I'm assuming it is better than the original edition, is still maybe not quite as good as I would like. And honestly, there is one thing that this rulebook is missing at the very end here. There's no index. It'd be really handy to have an index, so as you're playing, you can find things really quickly, because some of the things might not be as obvious when you're reading through. There's a lot of information in there. This is a dense rule book, and well, I didn't find, once I actually got into the game, with this Rondel and everything, I didn't find it too bad to play. I think it is a challenge to learn, and I think it is more challenging than something like Gloomhaven to learn. And I'm just comparing this to other dungeon crawls that I've played. I do think, I mean, since this is a game that was originally on Kickstarter, rulebooks tend to be not always quite as good. I mean, even I talk about Gloomhaven, but like Tainted Grail doesn't have the best rulebook in terms of laying out the information. And I do think they do a good job of laying out the information and putting it in an order that makes sense. There's, excuse me, just a lot to get through in there. And then, like I said at the beginning, this is a dark theme. I think there will be some people who do not love this dark theme to the game, this kind of adult content that is put in there. In the very first kind of tutorial scenario, if you wanted to play it on hard mode, you can add in an extra guard, and the flavor text has the guard smoking a bong. Now, that doesn't necessarily turn me away. It's not a major part of the game, of the story of the game. It's just some flavor text in there. But for some people, that might be more than they want in there. And some of the wounds that you can get, things like that, there are victims around the boards, and the bad guys can take out the victims if the heroes fail to rescue them. And so there's things like that. There's grotesqueness in the artwork. But yeah, I talk about that. I don't have an issue with it, and personally, I really like the artwork. So I think it's something just to be aware of. But the artwork, I enjoy it. I think that it works well for the game and definitely builds up the theme. And one thing I do really like about this game, though, is you can play it as a campaign. And the campaign itself is not a massive 100 scenarios. The campaign is a fairly short campaign, and you don't have to play it as a campaign. You can do it as a one-off dungeon crawl, which to me is really nice, because I have a lot of campaign games that do interesting things or different things. And there's a lot of them where my choices are I can play it solo, so that I can play it all through by myself, or I need to find a dedicated group to play for a long period of time. Tainted Grail, that has been over a year to get through 2 of the 3 campaigns in there. Gloomhaven was about 3 years, 2.5 years, something like that. Pandemic messed up the timeline, but that took a long time to get through. This, if I want a dungeon crawl experience, I can pull that out and play right away. As far as things like player count, so I have played this solo thus far, and I've played multi-handed solo. And I think that's something to talk about, because true solo in this game would be very difficult. The game doesn't necessarily scale as much as it could for different player counts. The game has a sweet spot for the number of players, and it can be more challenging fewer players you have. Let's look at this Rondel again. So let's say we had 2 people here in charge. Well, if both of those spots are full, I can't take that charge action, but I don't have to spend an action point to skip over that section because it's full. In a lower player count game, they give you an option, and I recommend you do it, for a ghost peg to basically be a non-existent player that always moves 5 spots around the board, just so that it might seem like it's blocking, but really it's allowing you to move faster. Now, if it happens to end on rest here and you want it to rest, that sucks. But if it ends on rest, now that whole section or special is up here, that whole section's filled in. You can skip it and it allows you to move faster and do more by moving around this without spending as many action points. So overall, I really have enjoyed my time with this game. I do like the dark theme. I think that it gives it an interesting flavor to the game. And it's a little bit of a different dungeon crawl because of that. But that's been my thoughts on Dragon Dawn Games, Perdition's Mouth, Abyssal Rift. Again, I want to say they did send me this copy for review. And that, don't have a drink, well, don't have a beer, bottoms up.